In this video, we're going to take care of a few various odds and ends related to the indecision application, including the ability to remove individual options. But I want to start off this video by talking about this right here. This is our call to this.setState, and we know that we need to pass in a function and return an object, and that creates something that's a little verbose. We have a relatively simple thing here, setting an options value equal to an empty array, but it takes up 5 lines, which just makes our code a little more complex than it really needs to be. With arrow functions, we know that we have access to that shorthand syntax. When we have an arrow function that returns some value, we just put the value over here instead of having the curly braces. So for example, I could create a const num and set it equal to an arrow function that implicitly just returns some number. So I could return 12 plus 2, for example. Every time I call num, I'm going to get 14 back. Now the same thing is true if I were to put an array right here. I could call this and I would get an array back with 1, 2, and 3 as the items. But what about an object? Because an object actually uses those curly braces. So is this an object or is this the function body? Well, with arrow functions, it's going to treat this as the function body. So if we want to implicitly return an object, we have to go ahead and wrap it in parentheses. So now if we called num, we would get an empty object back. If we tried it like this, it would see an arrow function that returns nothing, so we would get undefined back. Now, how does that help us? Well, it's going to allow us to simplify all of our calls to this.setState. We're going to call this.setState, no way around that part. Then we're going to set up the first argument, which is our arrow function. We'll start off with our arguments list and our arrow, but this is where things are going to change. Instead of creating a function body and manually using return to return a new object, we're going to implicitly return that object. I'm going to set up the parentheses, which we need when we're implicitly returning an object. I'm going to set up the object itself. Then I can just go ahead and define whatever I want on that object. For example, setting options equal to an empty array. Now we have a 3-liner as opposed to a 5-liner. And for simple ones like this, where we just have a single property, you could even put this on 1 line. Now I'm not saying that less characters is always the right way, but when we are working with this.setState, being able to implicitly return an object definitely has its advantages. So there we have it. We have a fancy new little syntax for getting the job done, and we can test our app to make sure it still works. I'll add a few items. I'll click remove all, and all the items do indeed get removed correctly. So this code still is working. It's still setting the options state to an empty array. Now it's your turn. Your challenge is going to be to convert the other 2 this.setState calls. We have one right here in handle add option, and way at the bottom of the file, we have one inside of handle add option in the add action component. You're going to convert both of these from explicitly using return to implicitly returning an object like we just set up right here. Now, when you are done, test your work. Make sure that new items still show up and make sure the error comes and goes away as expected. Take some time to knock this one out, test your work, and when you're done, click play. All right, that should have been an easy one. I'm going to go ahead and kick things off by converting this guy right here where we add the new items. I do still want to call this.setState. I do still want to pass in a function. This time though, instead of explicitly setting up the function body and returning the object, I'm going to implicitly return the object by wrapping the object in parentheses. Now we can go ahead and define that object, which is going to look exactly the same as this object. We just have our one property definition, so I can take that, copy it and paste it. Perfect. The last thing to do is to make sure to name previous state. There we have it. Now you could keep this on 3 lines, or you could choose to break it into 1 line. Their choice really is yours. I'm going to keep this one on 3 lines, and then we'll move on down below to the other this.setState call. Right here, this one is a whole lot simpler, so I'm most likely going to keep this one on 1 line, and we can actually just convert it without needing to rewrite it from scratch. So we have our object. I'm going to cut that out because we still want it. I'm then going to remove the curly braces as well as the return keyword. And then I'm going to implicitly return that object. So there we have it. This one sits real nicely just on a single line. Now, before we move any further, let's test our work. I'm going to submit the form with no item. The error shows up. I add an item. The error goes away. I try to add a duplicate. It shows up again. Everything seems to be working as expected. So with that in place, we've simplified our code a little bit, and we've enabled ourselves to use the new arrow function shorthand with our objects. Real handy trick. We're going to be using that for all of our set state calls from here on out because we never do anything inside of set state except for return the object right away. Now that we've adjusted the set state syntax, let's go ahead and dive into the meat of the video, which is to add a remove button next to each individual item. So currently we have a way to remove everything, but as we saw in the final version of the app, we want a way to remove just one item. So if I add a few options like A, B, and C, I can remove B individually, leaving A and C behind. I could also go ahead and use remove all to remove everything. So we have those two ways to remove. We can remove everything, or we can remove an individual item. Currently, next to our items, we do not have any remove button. So we're going to go ahead and actually fix that. We're going to be wiring everything up. Now, this is actually going to be slightly more complex than anything we've done before. So I'm going to go ahead and walk you through this step by step. First up, we're going to create a new method that is going to be responsible for taking in an option, the one you want to delete, and using set state to actually remove it. We're going to call this one handle delete option singular. This one, unlike the plural version, is going to take the individual option you want to remove, and it's going to go through the process of removing it. For the moment, we can just use console.log to ensure that it's getting called. I'm going to print out HDO for handle delete option, and then I'll also dump the option text. If we can at least get this showing up correctly, then we can use a set state call to actually knock the rest of it out. Now, step one is going to be to bind this right here. I'm going to set this .handle delete option equal to itself bound to the correct component using bind and binding to this. Now, we want to pass this down into option, but we don't have direct access to option. What we do have access to is options, though. So we're going to pass this into options, and we're going to allow options to pass that in to option. And this creates some pretty complex prop chaining. We have data, we have this function flowing all the way down through the chain. Later on in the course, we're going to look at an alternative way to get this done, but that's going to require a much more complex setup. So we're going to hold off on that for now, and we're just going to stick with using the tools we know about. So right here, we will pass down handle delete option singular, and we will set it equal to the method we just defined, this .handle delete option. So now this method, it's getting its way into options. But what we really need is to get it into option where the actual button is going to live. So we're going to pass it one more layer down. That means we want to add it on right here as a prop. Now this line is getting a little long. So before I add on the new prop, let's go ahead and break this up into multiple lines. And I'm going to do that by cutting out the JSX, adding in parentheses, and putting that JSX expression on its very own line. Then I'm going to take the individual props and shift them onto their own line as well. Awesome. Now that we have this in place without changing the functionality, we can actually add on the prop. Right here, that is going to be handle delete option, notice singular, and then we're going to go ahead and set it equal to the brand new prop that we just set up for options. Props dot handle delete option. Excellent. So now that the data is correctly getting into option, we can actually set up the button, we can call the method, and we should see our console.log printing way up above. So what I'm going to do right here is just set up that button, a new button with the text of remove. We'll close it off, and then we'll set up the on click attribute. On click, what do we want to do? We just want to have that one method run. That is props dot. Right here, we passed it down, handle delete option. Excellent. Now, if we go ahead and save this, we're not going to get what we want. Why not? Because we never use the props option text. So how are we supposed to have that passed in as an argument? If I actually go ahead and try to click that button, you can see down below what we're getting is our HDO, our string that we typed. But down here, we're actually getting the event object. So we know that our event handlers, this method up above, they get called with the event object. We don't want an event. We want the option text instead. So how are we going to do that? There are a few different ways we can get that done. The first way would be to change how option works. So down below, instead of passing in props.handle delete option, we're going to define an inline arrow function. Let's go ahead and play around with that. I'm going to break things out onto their own line. Then right here, I can go ahead and actually set up that prop. So the goal is to pass in an arrow function. We'll worry about calling handle delete option in a little bit. I'm going to pass in an arrow function. This arrow function is going to get called with the E argument when the button gets clicked. And what we're going to do is call props dot handle delete option, and we're going to call it with props dot option text. Now, if I go ahead and actually save the program and click that button, we should see the correct stuff printing. I'm going to type in an option, second story. I'm going to click remove, and down below we're getting HDO and we're getting the correct text. We are getting second story showing up, and it's showing up because we've created a function in line down here and we've explicitly passed it up to the handle delete option method. This is getting the data to the right place, but it's actually not manipulating it in any meaningful way. So we're going to want to go ahead and actually do that up above by filling out handle delete option. This one is going to need to call this dot set state, and we're going to go ahead and call it with our updater function. We're going to set up our arrow, and like we just learned about, we are going to implicitly return an object. On this object, we're going to define the piece of state we want to update. In this case, it is the options array. Then we're going to define our updates. Now we want to access the previous state. We want to remove a single item. So previous state. Down below, we're going to use prev state dot options. Now, currently, we're not changing anything at all. We are setting the options array equal to its old value. What we're going to do, though, is use the filter array method. So we can check that out over inside of the browser. You can Google MDN filter JavaScript. Like map and for each, it takes a callback function. It gets called one time for every item, but filter lets you filter various items from an array, and it returns a brand new array with just the filtered items. So here, for example, they have a bunch of words, and they set up a filter call. It checks the length for each word. If it's greater than 6, the callback function returns true. If it is less than or equal to 6, it returns false. When filter returns true, that individual item is included in the new array. When it returns false, it is not included in the new array. And we're going to use this exact same technique inside of our application code. So we're going to call filter on options, and we are going to set up our arrow function. This arrow function gets called with the individual option. This is exactly what we saw for both for each and map. And then we choose to return true if we want to keep this item in the array, or false if we do not want to keep the item in the array. So if I were to set up the code like this, we would delete every single item when we clicked the remove button for any item. And we can prove that. I can save app.js. I'm going to add a few items in. I'm going to click the remove button for one of them and everything goes away. That's because we are statically returning false. If I were to statically return true, that would result in nothing getting deleted. So obviously we want a little bit of conditional logic inside of here. What we're going to do is we are going to dig into the option right here, and we're going to see if it equals the argument that got passed in. Now we have a problem, right? We have an option argument here, which is the string, and we have an option argument here, which is the string to remove, and they both have the same name. So we're going to want to go ahead and fix that. I'm going to call this one option to remove. Now we have two distinct variables, and we can go ahead and actually compare them. We're going to check if option to remove equals the option. Now, if it does equal the option, it's going to return true, meaning that the one that we intended to delete is actually going to end up being the only one that stays in the array. So we're actually going to flip that. We want to check if they're not equal. If the two are not equal, that means it's not an item we want to remove. We're going to return true. It'll stay in the array. Otherwise, we'll remove it once we find the match. Now we can play around with this. I can save app.js. Over in the browser, I can add a few items. I can then click remove for one of them and the individual item goes away. If I remove one more, that individual item goes away. And obviously I still have access to remove all should I want to completely wipe the list. So there we have it. We now have the ability to remove individual items in our React application. Since we are just setting up an arrow function that returns an expression, we can use the shorthand syntax. I will take our comparison operator. I will cut it out. Then I'm going to remove the curly braces and everything in between. And finally, I'll just put the expression right here. Now we have the exact same functionality without all of the verbosity. And there we have it. We have the ability to remove an individual item. So let's take a quick moment to recap what we did. In previous videos, we set up methods like handle delete options and we passed them down a single layer. For example, we passed it into options right here and we called it down below when you click remove all. All we did this time is we created a method and we passed it down multiple layers. We passed it into options first, then options went ahead and passed it into option. That allowed this component to determine when it should be removed. In this case, when the remove button gets clicked. Now, when the remove button gets clicked, we don't just call the method directly because then we would be passing the event argument up. Instead, we define a little function right here that allows us to actually go ahead and call this with the correct data. So we can explicitly pass in props.optionText to the handle delete option method. That is it for this video. We're going to continue on in the next one, so stay tuned. I'll see you then.